Welcome to Session 3 in Stream 2, Looking Through the Lens of Diversity. I'm Liz Pia, a volunteer with Abuse Hurts, moderator for today's session. Our next speaker is Nicole Stibbe, who will be speaking on the importance of intercultural communication in building effective relationships. If you're in the wrong session, please navigate to the session you're looking for through the menu on the left of your screen. Click on the Sessions button, then click on the session you would like to attend. But I hope you can attend today. For Nicole. If you have any questions you would like to ask Nicole at the end of the session, please use the chat section. With over 25 years in the corporate space as a leader, mentor, trainer, and strategic advisor to organizations of all sizes, Nicole challenges companies to leverage their focus and pay attention to what matters most, developing a culture of inclusion, belonging, and well-being so employees can thrive. Nicole believes that meaningful connections ensure effective collaboration with teams, which is why Nicole emphasizes the importance of empathy, compassion, and vulnerability in her work. She creates space for employees to feel comfortable and heard, which allows for her to develop and implement corporate strategies that improve well-being and promote employee engagement, inclusion, and belonging through broad-based EDI-focused innovative interventions. Nicole is an accomplished EDI and employee well-being practitioner and expertly guides organizations to understand and assess the links between the two areas while bringing EDI to the forefront of the workplace and ensuring it's maintained as a priority. Nicole holds certificates in leadership and inclusion by design, and disability management, and as a qualified assessor of the Intercultural Development Inventory. She is also a certified coach and is working towards her certificate in race-based workplace investigations. Nicole is also a Bachelor of Science graduate from University of Toronto. Welcome, Nicole, and thank you again.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So thrilled to be here today to talk about something I'm really passionate about. It's in that EDI space, but it is about communication and how our communication affects our relationships. We have a limited time here today, and this is such a deep topic. So I'm going to, kind of assume kind of a baseline approach here. But there's so much more to learn and to develop as we enhance our relationships with each other. So in today's session, we're going to talk about culture and what that is. And we're going to talk about cultural awareness and some other options for cultural awareness. We're going to talk about the importance of self-awareness. And then we're going to talk about communication, some of the challenges that it poses. My goal here today is just to hope that you come away with just a little bit of a deeper understanding of how we communicate and how culture plays into our communication, our style, our words, and how we just interact with each other. So I want you to take a look at this slide. Some that may have had some training or some courses in EDI may have seen this before. So just take it in for a second, and now it's gone. What did you see? What came to mind when you saw that picture? It's a test that's usually used to develop some, to assess what we see around us. So if you can remember what you saw in that picture, what stood out for you? What was noticeable for you? When we go back to this picture, this is actually the Michigan fish test. And the purpose of this test is to provide a window into the way people perceive the world and a culture around us. It was developed as a test to test our view of the world. And participants of different countries were shown this exact picture. And although everyone saw the same picture, it seemed like they were describing different things. But it wasn't that they were describing a different picture. It was more based on what they were observing, what they observed in the same picture. Even though everybody saw the same picture, what they observed was different. What's interesting is that this test was done between Americans and Chinese and Japanese and Americans. Americans generally described the three big fish. That caught the eye of Americans. And they were able to identify those three fish in different contexts later on as well. They'd be like, oh yeah, I remember those three fish. I remember the three big fish. The Americans, though, they miss the snail, they miss the frog, they miss the smaller fish, and they miss the plants. The Japanese and the Chinese picked up on the frog, the snail, the smaller plants, the smaller fish, and the big fish. One interpretation is that the Americans have a mindset that is very much focused on the bigger the better, the individual, what is the focus of the picture, and that's typically what they picked up on. But the Chinese and the Japanese look at the collective, and it's all in terms of our cultural lens. What this tells us is that we learn to see the world around us through our unique view, or that cultural lens, which has often been shaped by our cultural values. We can't talk about communication without talking about culture. So what is culture? We hear culture a lot, like, oh, that culture does this, or that culture is typically like this. But really, what is culture? I'm based in Toronto, and a lot of our festivals were back this year, which was incredible. And what was interesting is that, we had the Ukrainian Cultural Festival. We also had the Caribbean Cultural Festival. Well, one's a country, one's a series of countries, several countries makes up the Caribbean. So what is culture? Is culture a country? Is it a series of countries? It's both. Culture is so many things. And you can see here, culture has many dimensions to it. We have the surface culture, so the visible culture. And that's everything from food and flags, festivals, music, games, language, literature, all of those things that we can see or hear. But then we have the deep culture. That's the invisible. And these are things that make up culture as well. And it's everything from our communication style and rules, our facial expression, the touching, the tone of voice, to our concepts of time, to our past and our present and our future, the differences in fairness and justice. We have notions of what manners are, what leadership is, what beauty is, what modesty is. And we have attitudes towards justice or authority or cooperation. All of these things make up culture, and some are very visible. Some of them aren't very visible. And this is where we get into challenges in understanding culture. So culture is typically, it's shared between both the surface, so the visible, and the deep, the invisible elements. And the values, beliefs, and behaviors combined give us the culture. We are all influenced by culture, and it's shaped by many different factors. It's shaped by parents and how we were raised. It's shaped by school. It's shaped by work. It's shaped by media. It's shaped by politics. Culture informs the way we dress. It informs the way we eat. It informs what we eat. Some cultures will eat with a knife and fork. Some cultures eat with their hands. Some cultures eat with chopsticks. We're all influenced by culture, and it's shaped by all these different factors. Culture is very dynamic. It's ever evolving. We can also move between cultures, and that's what makes cultures great. Think about a home culture, what the culture is at home versus work. And we can fluidly move between those cultures. How we get up in the morning, we're in our home environment, we're home in the afternoons, in the evenings, in the weekends. We can go into an office. There's a different office culture, and we can move between these cultures, and it's not a problem for us. Sometimes if the cultures are very extreme, sometimes it affects our emotional well-being, and we just have to be cautious of that. If we're in a role at work that it almost goes against our grain and our culture, that could impact us. The culture is everywhere. It's within a community, it's in a workplace, it's in a country, it's in a church group. Culture is all around us, it's everywhere. There's some dangers, though, when we talk about culture. Sometimes we talk about, and we hear it a lot, the Canadian culture. Canadian culture is so nice. Everybody's just so nice there. And that's really generalizing a culture. It's generalizing the behaviors and values. But within that Canadian culture, there actually could be regional cultures or generational cultures that we need to take into account. So although we may have a national culture, it's not static. There could be different subcultures as well. And we may not all share the same behaviors or beliefs within a national culture, for example. But there are sometimes some shared beliefs and values and behaviors that give us that national culture. But not every single person may share those same beliefs or values of that national culture. The other danger is that sometimes we use we generalize when speaking of an ethnic group or race. And this is where sometimes we get into challenges with culture. So how do we work with different cultures? And is cultural, we hear a lot about cultural awareness. Is it enough? Is it enough to be culturally aware? Well, the base definition of cultural awareness is the recognition of nuances of our own culture and other cultures. It sounds good for us to be cultural aware, but is it enough? It's not really enough. It's not enough to be culturally aware. I could be aware of another culture, but do absolutely nothing to increase my understanding or my appreciation of that other culture. So what's the answer? We hear a lot about cultural competence or cultural competency. And if you Google it, there's thousands of articles on cultural competency, which is great. It is that next level and it's fantastic. I would argue, though, that we actually need to be more cultural humble. Cultural humility is where this comes into play. And you can see there's a few differences here. With cultural competency, it implies that one can function with a thorough knowledge of the values and beliefs of another culture. The challenge, though, is that it's an endpoint. There's an endpoint to that learning. And sometimes we may feel, yep, I understand that culture. I've studied it. I get it. I can thrive in that culture. But remember, culture is dynamic. It's always changing. So there can't really be an endpoint to our learning. If we're culturally humble and we take a cultural humility approach, there's a willingness to accurately assess ourselves and our limitations in terms of our values and beliefs and what we believe in. It gives us the ability to acknowledge gaps in our knowledge and an openness to new ideas or contradictory information that may contradict our values and how we were raised or our behaviors. It also recognizes that culture is dynamic and constantly evolving. Keep in mind, a culture may look very different today than a year from now. That culture could be influenced by a new political leader, for example, and we've seen this. We've seen this with the US in the last few years. Different political leaders will influence the culture and then almost change behavior. Cultural humility also has a mutual respect and partnership based on trust. And it also gets us to ask questions. It gets us to be very curious without making an assumption. So you can see cultural competency would make the statement, I know who you are already. I'm an expert. Whereas cultural humility could say, I'm curious about who you are. Tell me more. And I'm leaning in and listening to what that more is. Why is cultural humility important? We live in a multicultural world. We live in a multicultural community. We live in a multicultural country. We live in multicultural buildings, multicultural workplaces. So everything around us is multicultural. Different cultures inform or influence our behaviors and beliefs. We often interpret others' behaviors according to our own values, and this often leads to an incorrect reading of situations. So we have these cultural lenses, and that's how we view the world, and it often leads to these incorrect readings of different situations. Culture shapes the way we interpret our behavior and others' behavior. And the influence of culture is often underestimated. We saw the iceberg. Sometimes we just make assessments and judgments based on the visible. And there's more of the invisible than there is the visible. We often interpret others' behaviors according to our own values. And of course, not every culture aspect of culture can be seen. So again, that cultural lens comes into play. And the emphasis on different values defines what we see or interpret. We all see things differently, but we often use it to form judgments. So for example, somebody who isn't providing eye contact, we may take that away as, wow, that was really disrespectful. It may not be. It actually may be a sign of respect. Cultural humility can also help us to make more respectful and insightful decisions. What does it require to be cultural humility? It's that willingness to understand ourselves and others. And without that willingness, we cannot be culturally aware or culturally humble. It also requires the desire to address and fix power imbalances because we want to learn more. We don't want to assume that our way is the best way, and we're ignorant of how other people are doing things or addressing things. So we actually want to address and fix any power imbalances. It requires us to engage in self-reflection and self-critique and have that awareness of ourselves. We're going to talk about self-awareness because it's such an important aspect when we're trying to be culturally humble. Cultural humility, though, does not require us to give up our own culture. I hear this far too often, and we actually hear it in some aspects where there's, kind of racist threads flowing through things like, oh, wow, these people come to our country and they're overtaking our country and they're changing, how we do things. And that's not what it means to be culturally humble. We don't need to give up our own culture. Being culturally humble is just a respect of other cultures as well as our own. It's not an if or it's and. To be self-aware, we've got to address our biases and our stereotypes. And what I'm going through here is just a very couple of quick slides on this, but I sometimes give deeper workshops into this, and these are half-day and full-day workshops. So I'm trying to combine as much information as I can in this session. So forgive me if we're, kind of just skimming the surface here. Self-awareness is our need to understand ourselves so we can appreciate others. When we understand ourselves, we then can better appreciate others. And self-awareness makes us realize the role that culture plays in our lives. And it makes us aware of our own biases while, kind of sparking that curiosity about other cultures. It helps us understand how we are shaped by the world around us and how our values influence and drive our own behaviors and opinions so that we can better understand others. It helps us be aware of our values, our biases, our perceptions so that they don't cloud our perception of others. Again, it goes back to the cultural lens. What does our lens look like? Are they cloudy or are they different color? Are they helping us to see things clearly, or are we seeing things through our own values and beliefs? When we're talking about self-awareness, it's very helpful to be very mindful. And I don't want to get too woo-woo here. And I know that there's been a lot of focus on mindfulness, and people say, oh, I don't really care about mindfulness. To be self-aware, though, you've got to be mindful. And mindful really is just being present. Where are you? What's affecting you? And being aware of that self-scan that sometimes we need to take and how we're feeling. So it's, consider self-scanning yourself when you're reacting to a situation, stepping back and saying, wow, why am I feeling this way about this person or this interaction? What was I expecting? What biases are coming into play here as I'm reacting or engaging with this person? Unconscious bias, again, we hear a lot about unconscious bias. We all have biases. I have biases. You have biases. Why do they exist? We may meet someone who is very different from us and really connect with them. But underneath the surface, we still hold these certain perceptions of what we expected them to do or behave or and we say it and we hear it a lot, like, wow, yeah, I didn't expect that from her, or I didn't expect her to say that. well, what were we expecting, and how does unconscious bias come into that play? And why does unconscious bias exist? At any one time, we've got 11 million bits of information coming at us. That's a lot of information, but we can only process 40 bits per second. So our mind will take the 40 bits and then store all of the other information. So we take in that information, and our mind then just creates these shortcuts, which has its benefits because it allows us to make quick decisions with limited information. But on the flip side, unfortunately, it causes bias. It results in bias. And unconscious bias is when a rule of thumb is created, when our minds create this rule of thumb. Again, it's not always bad. It allows us to make these shortcuts and quick decisions. But biases translates our behavior. And unfortunately, what happens is we often seek to confirm our bias. We seek to confirm that it exists. So when somebody doesn't fit into our box, we actually actively seek people who fit into the box to say, yep, see, I told you that culture was like that because of the one person that we had that interaction with. So unfortunately, this is where biases they can have that negative effect. So it's really important not to apply one piece of information to an entire group or an entire culture. And some quick questions to ask ourselves: what biases do I carry? Who do they affect? How do they affect my interactions with this person, this group? Stereotypes are widely held but fixed and oversimplified images or characteristics that we may believe represent a particular type of person, a thing, a group. It's formed by analyzing how something is similar or different from us. And they're usually formed by the outsider. People who are in the group don't form their own stereotypes. As outsiders, we form the stereotypes of them. Stereotypes are dangerous because they assume that we are the norm. And it's based on our own view of how that culture is similar or different from us. Stereotypes are often negative because we all want this need to be part of a group. And we want to feel really good about our group. That's our group. It's our community. So we tend to judge others that are different or aren't part of our group. And this is why there are negative stereotypes. Often the challenge with stereotypes, as we know, is that it doesn't take into account that everyone is very unique. Some examples of stereotypes just very quickly. Yeah, I know a lot about that culture. They're a really hardworking culture. Or they don't really engage with their families a lot. They're always working. They're very focused on work. Or being aggressive versus gentle. Or you've got to be really hard with your questions because that culture is very suspicious of others versus very friendly or open. Or being seen as withholding or generous. These are just some. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of different stereotypes that we form, again, based on our own values and beliefs. Let's talk about communication and how this all comes into communication. For us, in kind of that North American context, we rely heavily on voice. We rely heavily on verbal communication. That's just one form of communication. Communication is how we get messages across, how we engage with people. It's the exchange of information, but 75% of communication is actually nonverbal. And we can see here the different types of other communications, the nonverbal communications, body movements, facial expressions, eye contacts, paralanguage, so the rate, volume, and pitch. I know when I get excited or happy, my pitch goes up, my rate of speaking tends to increase, and that's quite normal. But in some cultures, they're very monotone. And, think about, somebody in human resources who calls up somebody to offer them a position, and there's no excitement. And they feel, wow, this person must not really have wanted that job. They weren't very excited. Well, in their culture, they may not show that type of emotion through their paralanguage. Personal appearance is another aspect. Physical environment is another type of communication, how our physical environment is set up. Personal space, are you a close talker or a far talker? Touch, when we go to console somebody, do we pat them on the shoulder? Do we stand back? Do we hug them? Do we kiss them? Time is an interesting one, but it is such a form of communication. Different cultures have different concepts of time. There's the structured time and flexible time. Structured time is, it's typical, our North American way of doing things. Time is money. We've got to go. You've got to be on time. Versus that flexible where time it's indefinite. There's lots of time. And I know from my own culture, my mother's West Indian, dinner's at 4, that actually means dinner's at 6. So if you show up at 4, be prepared to help with dinner because we're not eating till 6, which is very different from my husband who's German when he first showed up to one of our events, and he showed up right on time because you show up on time. So there's different concepts of time as well, and this is another form of communication. There's different approaches to verbal communication, and that's just one thing. So we went through all the lists of different types of communication. There's approaches to them as well. I want to hone in a little bit on different approaches to verbal communication because there's two. There's direct, where our words are literal, clear wording. It's a focus on task, getting things done. The wording is quite literal. This is usually in our North American context versus indirect, where not everything is said in words. And often there's another context that has to be in play. We have to listen to the words in partnership with maybe body language or eye contact or touch. The combination gives that verbal communication, that type of communication. There's a reliance on unspoken elements, and we prefer to say things in an indirect culture and an indirect approach to communication. We say things that we often avoid, so that we avoid confrontational work. So a no may actually be replaced with possibly or yes. Do you want to go to dinner tonight? Instead of saying no, I may not want to offend you. So I may say possibly or yes, but I actually mean no. There's some values that are tied to communication. You can see the different structures that are, and this is why we get miscommunication. There's so many different elements to communication. Face is a value that is tied to communication often, so saving face. Face in different cultures, there's that protection of reputation or avoiding challenging others. And it's a focus on group harmony. You may say yes to enhance that and protect the group harmony. We avoid saying what one means. There's also formality that is a value that's tied to communication, how things are done. Think about, in most cultures, it is okay to shake hands. That's acceptable. That's a formal communication. That's a formal greeting. But in some cultures, it could be a bow. It could be the bowing of head without eye contact. And these are sometimes misinterpreted as either disrespectful or why didn't they shake my hand? That was odd. Lots of challenges in communication, and this is just, kind of a mimic of this. It's international arrivals, people coming from all over the world, and you can see here different responses to how people are engaging. One gentleman is holding out his hand and there's no reception on the other end. Another person is bowing with a business card. Somebody is involved in somebody's personal space. And you can see the two perceptions here. Whoa, my personal space, you're in my personal space. Whereas the other person's like, wow, he's not letting me in his personal space. He seems a little bit unfriendly. So you can see how communication can get misinterpreted. Some of the incorrect assumptions or consequences of miscommunication and misreading cues sometimes. Sometimes we feel the truth isn't being told. Body language may be misinterpreted, or expressions may be misinterpreted. I didn't trust him. He didn't look me in the eye. I don't trust him. I don't trust anything he said. Could be a perception that somebody's hiding information. Somebody may withdraw or not provide information. Think about somebody who protects their personal space, and it's disrespectful to be in the personal space. You're in my personal space. How much information am I willing to share with you? You've almost offended me. You're in my personal space. Maybe seen as guarded or quiet. There could be a perception of there's a lack of trust or respect. And that lack of respect that we may feel, wow, that person is very disrespectful, may actually be A sign of respect. Me not looking you in the eyes actually could be a sign of respect in a certain culture. How do we avoid conflict or misunderstanding? There's a long list. I put a lot here for you. Avoiding jokes, jargon, slangs, or cliches. Sometimes we actually need to remove language from what we're saying. Sometimes it's just flat out offensive. A couple of key terms. I heard the other day in a focus group I was conducting, somebody said, well, I'm just the bottom of the totem pole. That's not a phrase that we want to be using anymore. It's disrespectful. Even the term stakeholder, which we continue to hear over and over again, is actually disrespectful to Indigenous culture. So these are things we always have to remember. Culture is constantly evolving. We have to evolve with it. Avoid closed questions, questions that require a yes or no. Because remember, in some cultures, they don't want to say no. They think it's disrespectful to say no. So you may not get a no. Speak clearly, match the pace of the other participant, showing interest or appreciation, maybe leaning in and just making sure that you're really paying attention. Begin where they are and not where you want them to be. Again, our concept of time, and we got to go, move this story along a little quicker, maybe disrespectful. Somebody's trying to share information with you. And sometimes we have to give them the time. They're going to get to where we want them to be at some point. We've got to allow them the space to do that. Be curious, watch, mimic what they're doing. Notice how you're feeling. Again, what biases are coming into play? Why am I feeling this way? Why did I assume that this was going to happen this way? Be flexible and adaptable. Notice what they're saying and what they're not saying, again, with caution, because sometimes body language, eye contact could have different things. Clarify your intentions. This is an important one. My husband's a police officer. We've had this conversation before because when he goes into homes, when police officers go into homes, they typically don't take off their police boots because if they have to go, they've got to go. They can't be sitting there tying up their shoes. But it's that the clarifying the expectations and saying, I'm here to talk to you. I can't take off my boots. Do you want to talk to me here, or are you comfortable with me coming into your home? Because not removing your shoes could be highly disrespectful to some people. Listen, be empathetic, check for understanding. Do you understand? Is there anything I can clarify for you before I leave? Do you have any questions? Don't assume that the meaning of a word is universal or that the behavior is universal. I love this quote from Maya Angelou, do the best until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Again, we're constantly learning, constantly adapting. We will make errors. It's our human nature. We've got to learn and apply the learnings going forward. So in summary, only use knowledge of other cultures to make some useful generalizations. But you've got to remember, everybody might be a little bit different. Use it to understand the mechanics of that culture. Be self-aware. Have a deep respect for cultural differences. Be curious. Be sensitive. Be respectful. Be open-minded. I got to change. I know I've got to change. I've got to learn. I'm constantly learning. Don't make assumptions. Go in with a beginner's mindset. I love going into things with a beginner's mindset. And it's actually quite unique. Just going in like I don't know. Help me understand. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to be curious. I'm going to watch. I'm going to watch how people behave. And I'm going to learn from that. Honor everyone as an individual, not as a member of a group or category. And keep in mind, we don't need to be an expert on every culture. Sometimes I work with organizations that have people all over the world. Their employees are all over the world, or they travel throughout the world, and they say, how do we be experts on every culture? You don't need to be. You don't need to be an expert on every culture. You just need to recognize the differences and apply some of the practices that we've gone over today about being aware that there are differences and how we expect may not be the way that people are going to behave. That was a lot, I know, in the short time we had. Liz, I'm not sure if there's any questions.
Yes, there is actually. There's a few questions, and thank you so much, Nicole. That was really great. Um, I'm going to ask my question after we go to the chat section. Veronica Noel has a question for you. What is the difference between cultural appreciation versus appropriation?
Cultural appreciation is actually what it is. It's appreciating another culture. Appropriation is where you actually take elements of a culture and almost kind of own it yourself. And this is where, people get into some challenges with the two. Because you can appreciate somebody's culture or some of the elements of the culture. But when you take elements, so for example, how people dress, or when you see somebody, it's a very common example, I actually saw it yesterday, of maybe somebody who is white with red hair or with dreadlocks or braids. That could be considered appropriation, which is sometimes quite offensive.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a question. So I
Mm-hmm.
was really impressed with even just bringing the reminder of everything that we should know. But what about being the bystander? So you're listening to other people making comments. What would you recommend on how to manage that?
People making negative comments.
Yeah.
Okay, this is where we get into, are you an ally or not? And we all should be allies to other cultures, other ethnicities, other races. But we can't assume that the person that is the target of the comment is going to speak up for themselves. One, it's exhausting. I've been in that situation myself. It's exhausting always having to call people out or in. But you would hope that you have allies that are actually going to challenge and say, oh, wow, Liz, what did you mean by that? I noticed you said this to Nicole. What did you mean by that? Or flat out, Liz, that was offensive.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you should have said that. That was offensive. And this is where we need to build that allyship, which is challenging, but it's definitely possible.
That's great. Thank you. Because I think as individuals, sometimes we don't realize what we say until someone actually tells us what we're doing.
And it goes back to Maya Angelou, right? When we know better, we do better. And
Exactly.
sometimes we need our community to actually address it for us to say, wow,
Mhm.
did you know? Oh my gosh, no, I didn't realize it,
Mhm.
but I'm going to do better.
Absolutely. And I think Marcus has a question for you. Go ahead,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Marcus.
Well, no, we just we had a couple of one question from one person. They're asking, I guess, we have to bring it down to maybe just Canada, but the question is, do the gatekeepers like EMS, police, fire, do they do this type of training? Do they get this type of training? Because this would probably be very useful across that board because they are experiencing a lot of different cultures. And in these scenarios, these cultures, they're running into fires. So they're running into problems and stuff. So do they get this type of training? Because this is something that'd be very useful.
Such a great question. I do know that some police forces have it as part of their training. How much emphasis they put on it, I'm actually not sure. And I do know, because I have my husband's niece is a paramedic, that she did undertake some training. I'm going to be honest, this is, there's always work to be done. And the expectation that somebody, on top of all of the other emergency training that they go through, remembers, maybe, kind of an hour or two. This is something that I feel needs to be, it's always in place. I think there's always more training that can be done. Even for myself as a practitioner, I am constantly looking to see how I can learn more.
I agree. Yeah, that's
Amazing.
great.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Nicole. We really appreciate it from the Hope Conference team for you joining us today and taking the time out to speak with us. And if anyone that's participating in this session Nicole actually has her information in the exhibit booth that you can take a look at. And also, I've also connected with you on Instagram and LinkedIn today. So please start building our network so that we can start just collaborating as well together. So thank you so much, Nicole, for the time that you took to spend with us today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me here today. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too. Bye now.
Bye-bye.